the Committee to Protect Journalists says more journalists were killed in 2024 than in any other year. The organization says at least 124 journalists and media workers were killed last year, nearly two-thirds of them Palestinians. Let's chat about this further now. We speak to Muthoki Mumo, who's Africa Program Coordinator, Committee to Protect Journalists, who joins us live now. Thank you so much, Muthoki, for your time. I mean, just going through the data that you've been able to collate is scary, especially when you think about this as a journalist. So this figure is certainly worrying, and it speaks to the dangers that, media practitioners, reporters, workers are facing on a daily basis.
Yes, certainly. And when we look at this data, as you said, it's the highest figure we've ever recorded of journalists killed in a single year since we started collecting this data in 1992. So that's a period of over 3 decades. And what we see in this data is that a lot of deaths are associated with conflict. In conflict and post-conflict situations, that's where you see many of the journalists being killed. As you've already mentioned, a lot of the deaths have been associated with the ongoing, with the Israel-Gaza war. And we also see in other parts of the world where conflict is a concern, that there's a correlation that journalists are killed. For instance, Sudan, which had the highest number of journalists killed on the African continent in 2024. We know there has been a devastating civil war there. And even if we look at other parts of the continent, so for instance, Mozambique, where there's a post-election crisis since October, we recorded one blogger killed there. He actually was shot on live, while live streaming his coverage of the protest in that country.
And when you look at, what is taking place, and let's stay with Sudan, for example, and one would say, you run the risk of journalists not being there on the ground if they cannot be adequately protected, or they themselves are finding that they're now in the firing line.
Yes, and this is the tragedy, because when we speak about a journalist killed, we must think about the implications of this as sort of rippling out from that individual journalist. Yes, of course, it's a great tragedy when a civilian, when a single person loses their life in the context of conflict. But when journalists are taken away in this way, what we lose is stories. What we lose is the cliche is the first draft of history. You don't have that conflict, that war, that situation being told from as many perspectives, as diverse perspectives as possible. And in this way, you don't have a comprehensive understanding of the crises that we're facing. You don't have enough information or, comprehensive information that people need to make their decisions on an everyday basis. But the global community also needs, as we try to build peace in all these places where conflicts are. And ultimately, when the story of the conflict is told, I would argue there'll be chapters missing, there'll be stories missing, because these journalists were silenced in the ultimate way. They were unable to tell these stories.
In the work that you've done, were you able to also find that, because in the past we used to, when you go to either a service delivery protest or a conflict situation, as a journalist, then you'd wear a vest that's written media. Are these still being recognized, or any other form of identification to say I'm a journalist, don't shoot? Is that still working right now?
So this is a very interesting and important question. First of all, we have to recognize that in the context of international law, journalists are considered civilians. Civilians shouldn't be targeted, and their deaths should be avoided regardless of whether or not they're wearing a press vest. Now, having said that, we have documented instances where people were easily or readily identifiable as journalists being attacked or being targeted. And certainly my colleagues from the Middle East and North Africa program have documented this within the context of the Israel-Gaza war. I would like to share an example also from our region. Mm-hmm. I mentioned that there was a blogger who was killed in Mozambique while covering a protest, and he actually was shot at live while recording, readily identifiable. This is a man holding his phone, trying to record. There are not many ways to interpret what this person is doing and what their job is. And in fact, in the immediate in the few minutes before he was shot, we have a witness telling us that a police officer told him, stop shooting, stop recording, suggesting that this police officer knew exactly what this person was doing, that they were doing journalism, and shot them regardless of that. And if you just bear with me for a second, when this blogger is shot at while live streaming, dies hours later, a couple of days later at his funeral, journalists who were wearing press vests are again shot at by police. Fortunately, they don't die, though at least one of them is injured. But this just demonstrates that the ability to identify someone as a journalist, whether it's because they're holding a camera, whether it's because they're wearing a press vest, is not always protection. But again, we recognize journalists as civilians in these contexts, whether they're protesters or whether they're civilians in the context of a conflict, should never be targeted, should be protected.
Muthoki, it sounds like, targeting, premeditated in some of these cases?
Yes, so when we do this research as CPJ, if you allow me to get just technical a little bit, we usually ask ourselves what's the context in which this journalist was killed, or what's the context in which they died. And we talk about murders, and for us these are targeted killings in reprisal for journalism. But we also talk about journalists who are on dangerous assignment. So for instance, someone who was in a protest and ended up on the wrong side of a tear gas canister, for example. And we also talk about journalists in crossfire. These are journalists who are reporting conflict situations, who may not necessarily have been targeted directly in reprisal for their work, but were caught in that crossfire. Now, when we talk about the murders, the reprisals, this is very worrying, because what we're seeing is a rise in this category of killings around the world. And this should be chilling for everyone, because it means that someone recognized that this individual was a journalist. Someone recognized the work that they were doing, and someone decided to retaliate, to kill them precisely because of this work. So when we look across the world, we see these numbers rising. The Mozambique case that I've cited repeatedly, for instance, is an example where we've categorized it as murder because the blogger was identified, was recognized, he was recording, and he was shot based on the research that we have because of that. So that is particularly chilling, because there the intention cannot be mistaken. The intention is to silence.